Hi, good day, everyone, and welcome to this parallel event, Strengthening Institutions to Prevent the Trafficking of Children and Adolescents, being sponsored today by PACT, Protect All Children from Trafficking, Covenant House, the Working Group to End Homelessness, and the NGO Committee on Migration. I'm Lori Cohen, CEO of PACT, which for over 3 decades has been a leader in protecting every child's right to grow up free from sexual exploitation and trafficking. I will be moderating today's panel. We are gathered, as we do annually, under the umbrella of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, whose priority theme this year is accelerating the achievement of gender equality for women and girls by addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective. Though it is widely documented that women and girls comprise the majority of those trafficked for sexual exploitation, available statistics are inadequate to measure the unreported victims, many of whom are boys and trans, in part because sex trafficking is one of the most clandestine but lucrative and illicit crimes in the world. The presenters in today's panel will offer examples of the multifaceted intersectoral efforts to ensure the human rights of all children and adolescents to live a life free from trafficking by addressing root causes of vulnerability and building robust institutions to assist and protect them. So, what is an institution? It is defined as a structure of rules and norms that shape and constrain individual behavior. Laws and social conventions are examples. The United Nations, in 75 years, has made vigorous efforts to create institutions that protect children from trafficking through the adoption of internationally agreed conventions, which are legally binding to those states that become party to them. Another tool developed by the United Nations for protecting and promoting human rights has been the establishment of independent human rights experts, special procedures mandate holders, who report and advise on human rights either from a thematic or country perspective. We are deeply honored today that delivering our opening remarks is Professor Tomoya Obokata, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, including its causes and consequences. A professor of international human rights law at York Law School, he has extensive experience working on issues of transnational crime, human trafficking, and modern slavery. He joins us from the United Kingdom. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this very important event and for that kind introduction. My intervention will focus on the major causes of trafficking and exploitation of children and adolescents. But before that, I would like to briefly explain what I do in my role and how stakeholders can collaborate with me in the future. I was appointed to the role by the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2020. I deal with issues such as traditional slavery, which still exists in some parts of the world, forced and child labor, servitude, sexual exploitation or slavery, as well as child and forced marriage. My main function is fact-finding. For this, I produce thematic reports to the Human Rights Council as well as the UN General Assembly every year. I promised to take a victim-centered approach, and to this end, I have been focusing on the experiences of particularly vulnerable individuals. In the past, for example, I examined the exploitation of displaced persons and those belonging to minority groups. This year, I will be highlighting the experiences of currently and formerly incarcerated individuals. For the General Assembly, I normally look at wider issues. So, for example, I highlighted how modern technology is used to facilitate or prevent contemporary forms of slavery last year, and we'll be examining the role of trade unions this year. I issue call for inputs for each report, and this is where stakeholders can collaborate by submitting relevant information. Calls for this year's reports have been issued already, and I encourage the participants for today's event to take part if they have experience and expertise on this year's themes. I also conduct country visits in order to investigate how governments and other stakeholders address contemporary forms of slavery. So far, I have visited Sri Lanka, Mauritania, Costa Rica, Canada, and Cote d'Ivoire, and I will be visiting Australia later this year. During my visit, I meet a large number of stakeholders, including government officials, civil society, trade unions, business communities, as well as workers and victims of contemporary forms of slavery in order to receive first-hand information. Trafficking and exploitation of children and adolescents are an important part of my investigation. In addition, when I receive allegations of contemporary forms of slavery occurring in various parts of the world, I communicate directly with governments and others like businesses and employers in order to verify these allegations and urge them to take actions if these allegations are true. These communications will be made public on our website after a certain period of time for transparency. And this is another area where stakeholders can engage with me by forwarding relevant information for me to act upon. Undoubtedly, they are in the best position to be able to tell me what's happening on the ground. I would encourage participants today to get in touch with me in the future if they want me to address allegations of contemporary forms of slavery. And finally, I hold wider consultations and participate in events organized by stakeholders like this one with a view to facilitating dialogue and support their work to tackle human trafficking and exploitation. I would be very happy to take part in seminars, workshops, and other events in the future, so please do get in touch. Now, I would like to comment on the key causes of trafficking and exploitation of children and adolescents. First and foremost, poverty undoubtedly is a major cause of these practices. In many parts of the world, poverty often forces parents to rely on their children and adolescents to work in order to survive. This deprives them of opportunities for education and training, which in turn prevents them from obtaining decent work, thereby increasing their risk of exploitation in the future. Disturbing stories of sale and sexual exploitation of children and adolescents due to poverty have also been reported. It is important to stress here the intersecting forms of discrimination. Anyone can be affected by poverty and economic hardship, of course, but there are particularly vulnerable populations who are at the higher risk of experiencing them, including women, indigenous peoples, minorities, displaced persons and migrants, persons with disabilities, and LGBTQI+ individuals. Deep-rooted discrimination against these populations, which can be observed in all regions of the world, often prevent them from accessing quality education, adequate housing, decent work, and social safety nets, trapping them in a vicious cycle of poverty generation after generation in many cases. Another cause is neglect or family disintegration. Children and adolescents without the safety and security that the family environment can provide are particularly vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. An interlinked cause is homelessness. Last year, I dedicated my report to the Human Rights Council on this very topic and discovered that neglected children and adolescents often find themselves homeless and are targeted by traffickers and even legitimate employers for labor, sexual, and criminal exploitation. Culture also plays a part in some parts of the world. Trafficking of children for exploitation in cultural or religious practices and child marriage are good examples in this regard. In addition, children and adolescents are trafficked through grooming, which is both a cause and a method of exploitation. Grooming is not just for sexual exploitation, but also for radicalization, which sometimes lead to participation in terrorist and other dangerous activities. The role of modern technology should be highlighted here. My recent report to the General Assembly focused on this, as I said earlier, and discovered that internet sites and social media platforms such as TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook are being used to lure children and young people into exploitation. Humanitarian crises, including armed conflicts, as well as natural disasters like earthquakes and tsunami, provide opportunities for traffickers to exploit vulnerable children and adolescents, particularly when they are separated from their families. Girls and women are targeted for sexual exploitation, slavery, or forced marriage, and boys and young men are forcibly recruited to take part in armed conflicts as well as terrorist and other criminal activities such as drug production or trafficking and theft. And these have been evidenced in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, for example. Moreover, we need to remember that the demand for cheap labor promotes trafficking of children and adolescents. Although individual criminals and organized criminal groups are undoubtedly involved, it is clear that businesses and employers which aim to maximize profits by employing cheap labor force is also responsible. This underscores the importance of implementing the human rights due diligence among all businesses and employers, large or small, in accordance with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It is encouraging to see in this regard that an increasing number of UN member states have taken steps to strengthen due diligence through legislative and other means, and I urge others to follow suit. Further, we, the consumers of cheap goods, need to take more responsibility to eliminate child and forced labor. Learning more about how agriculture and other goods are produced in the supply chains is a good starting point, and together we can collectively lobby the governments and businesses to address such gross violations of human rights. States must also address the demand for sexual exploitation of children and adolescents more effectively. In addition to robust criminal justice responses, they should implement innovative ways to reduce reoffending. Technology companies must also do more to prevent their social media and other platforms and tools from being used to traffic and exploit and abuse children and adolescents sexually. At the broader level, states must intensify efforts to tackle gender discrimination, inequality, and stereotypes which promotes the culture and the environment for sexual exploitation, and to provide comprehensive human rights education for all. Finally, I would like to stress that securing equal access to education, adequate housing, decent work, and social safety nets for children, adolescents, and parents is the key in tackling trafficking and exploitation and ensuring that no one is left behind as per the commitments made under the Sustainable Development Goals. This will require closer and more effective cooperation and coordination with all relevant stakeholders, including civil society, workers' organizations, and regional and international partners. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you so much, Professor Obokata. I would like, your remarks are just so spot on, so comprehensive, and we're delighted about your offer to be available for future presentations. There will certainly be many people on this call who will be reaching out to you. I see that we have a number of questions from viewers, and we will, for Professor Obokata, we will take the questions now because he will need to get off this presentation before it concludes. Just so people know, for the remaining presenters, we will save the Q&A for the end. I see there are a number of questions. Professor Obokata, I'm going to start with the first one, which is you very generously offered to have this be a collaborative process where people can reach out to you and provide information. What is the best way for our viewers to be in contact with you? And we can put that information in the chat if that's helpful.
Sure. There is a generic email listed on my website, and then you can contact me through that. And then myself or the colleagues at the OHCHR supporting my mandate will be should be able to be in touch with relevant stakeholders.
Okay, and can you share your website? I know that I have your website information, but we can put it into the chat here. What would that be?
I just listed the email that people can use.
There it is.
HRC. Yeah, so if you could share that to stakeholders, I think that's in a, I don't know if the attendees can see that, but feel free to share that with the all participants today.
Okay, great. We'll go ahead and put that in the Q&A for people, or I'll add it to the chat. I'll put it in the Q&A as an answer. Okay. As we go on, let's do the first question. For your country visits, can you tell us some of the most effective interventions you have seen to address protection of children and youth from being trafficked?
Sure. In various countries I visited, the most effective way is at the multi-stakeholder approach in preventing human trafficking and protecting children and young people. That basically means not just obviously the governments have a primary responsibility, but when they work well together with other stakeholders such as civil society organizations and trade unions and others, and including survivors and the youth leaders and representatives. And that, to me, is the best way to promote a holistic and effective responses. And I've seen that happen in all countries that I actually visited in addressing, for example, child labor, child marriage, and exploitation, sexual exploitation of children and young people.
Thank you very much. The next question, widespread trafficking of children for coca production is well documented. From your visit to Côte d'Ivoire, what can be done?
Thank you. Yes, I just recently visited, and to give a credit to the government. Yes, government is intensifying its efforts to eliminate child labor, and I've seen some good results in that regard. But I think that one of the themes of this event today, the poverty, still is an ongoing issue. So it is important to assist the families and gain access to education and training. Financial inclusion is also important, and fairer wages and securing good working conditions. These are the important measures that the governments and at the local and national level must continue.
Thank you. Our next question, do you study the causes of trafficking from the standpoint of those that are profiting from the trafficking? I know you mentioned demand, and this is a question that's looking at the profiteering.
Of course, I think it's oftentimes we tend to forget that so-called a push factor where that pushes people into trafficking, but there's also pull factor, which demand to me in a Western consumer countries like United States, Europe, and so on, or Japan, my country, we need to pay closer attention to that and see how businesses and even criminals are exploiting that demand to supply children and adolescents. And I think yes, it is important to consider that, and we come up with ways to address it. And as I said in my talk, also that demand for cheap goods, which is driven by all of us, the consumers, and what can we do to make sure that children are not being abused in Coco and other places and so on. Then I do engage in ongoing discussions and dialogue with a number of stakeholders in this regard.
Thank you. And I just want to add, and I'm actually from PACT. I especially appreciate your comments about demand for children for sexual exploitation as well, because we often think of demand as just from the labor chain without thinking about the sexual exploitation. So thank you for including that in your remarks. The next question, you mentioned looking at survivors and victims who are criminal justice engaged. And there's a question about, can you describe any innovation activities to prevent reoffending?
Yes, that is a particularly difficult question for something like sexual exploitation, and that is, as you might be aware, there are separate mandate for looking at the particular issue that a special rapporteur on sexual exploitation of children. So I cannot comment in detail. But and how do we engage with the offenders, or for example, who engage in child sexual abuses, and whether it is an education, rehabilitation, and other means. A number of countries are doing that. And as we also advance with the use of advanced technology and things like that, which are increasingly being used to exploit individuals, we also need to pay attention to how we can use something like that to reduce reoffending one way or another. So I'm sorry that I can't give you a clear answer to that regard, but then I think there are a number of state practice emerging in these areas.
Thank you. Our next question, when you spoke of displaced children, how can we help such children access justice?
I think that's a very important question. That include, for example, refugees and asylum-seeking children, and what they need is at least a temporary right to stay, and they are entitled to seek asylum. There's no question, and the states must fairly determine their refugee status. And as soon as that is particularly children, we should give them a benefit of doubt first and foremost, and provide sufficient protection. It really doesn't matter if they are from foreign countries; they should be entitled to the same level of support and services as their own citizens and domestic children.
Thank you. That's a particularly relevant comment in this world of global crises and global migration of children, particularly speaking of someone in the United States where we're seeing this very issue. So I appreciate you for elevating that. And our last question, this is the last question we have time for today. What have stakeholder responses been when addressing intersectionalities of trafficking?
Yes, I think this is quite important. Thank you for that question. And I think stakeholders are including member states, and obviously civil society and other important stakeholders are increasingly addressing this particular issue. So it is not just about their age, but also related to ethnicity, religion, and other status that needs to be taken into consideration. So that is essential in promoting a more holistic approach to protection of children and young people, and prevention of human trafficking and slavery. So, but I am very encouraged to see, whoever I speak to, they always raise an issue of intersectionality, which I think is quite important too. Then I do my part in emphasizing that in my work.
Thank you, Professor Obokata. It's just fascinating to hear your responses. We're so grateful for your participation in this conference today.
No,
Unfortunately, we have many, many more questions. I anticipated you would be quite popular. If people want to leave the questions in the chat, we could try to forward the questions at a later point. But everyone else, I would encourage you to think if some of your questions could be repurposed for some of our other speakers today. But we really appreciate you joining us and
Thank you
wish
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, I'd like to encourage all participants to get in touch with me one way or another, and I'll be very happy to support your important work. So let's work together. So thank you very much once again for inviting me.
We really appreciate it. Thank you. Well, very exciting. Continuing on our discourse on institution building to protect against child trafficking, but switching to efforts of non-governmental organizations, PACT, Protect All Children Against Trafficking, where I am proud to serve as the CEO, has a long history of advocating for stronger laws and policies to prevent child exploitation, sexual exploitation, as well as better protection for survivors. We work with legislators, policymakers, and other advocates at all levels of government to create meaningful, impactful change. Unlike much of US politics at the moment, we have vigorous support from both sides of the political spectrum. A vital part of these efforts is the leadership of survivors with lived experience to inform and shape proposed legislation that addresses prevention and protection against child trafficking. I'm very honored today to introduce Katrina Massey, a member of PACT's Board of Directors and liaison to our Survivors Council. Katrina, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I do appreciate it. And thank you for everyone that's joined today. And, in an effort to address how to focus on the prevention of trafficking, Professor Obokata did mention things such as, poverty and minors without homes, also past traumatic experiences. And as we think more about what does that look like, how do we prevent trafficking rather than just serving the response of being trafficked, there are several things that come to mind and some things that we've worked on as an organization, one of which is public awareness campaigns. So often, those of us that attend these conferences has a very clear understanding of who and what trafficking looks like and what that is, but the mass majority still don't know and don't know that, it's happening as close to home as one would think, no matter where you are in the world. And having public awareness campaigns and just educating the public, whether it's through public transportation, whether it's through commercials, radio, it kind of reminds me of some of the issues that we've addressed in the States when you think of when meth was an issue in the United States, and it is still an issue, and how that public awareness campaign was spread nationally to bring more attention to what that is and what, and what to be aware of. One of the efforts that we've made at PACT is working on a federal awareness campaign that focused on transportation and alerting riders of what trafficking may look like, and also giving an opportunity for people to learn more about it, because you may hear conversations here and there, but how do I dig more into what this looks like? And so, we've worked on those campaigns and also programs around child sexual abuse material, the prevention of that. We currently have a federal bill, which is the Child Online Safety Act, where there are guardrails that are needing to be put in place to protect children from what they see and what they have access, as well as traffickers having access to them. So those are some things that could have a great deal in effect on the population of those who are and aren't being trafficked. But again, public awareness is key. This has to become a day-to-day conversation amongst parents, amongst the community, in school curriculums, as well as, community rec centers, things of that nature. It can't be taboo to have these conversations. And even more, being aware of what those high risk factors are, knowing what those high risk factors are, and training law enforcement and first responders, oftentimes when they're tends to be a bit of challenge or issues in the home, the first person you call could be law enforcement. It may be first responders, and being able to identify those high-risk populations and having the ability to refer those to other agencies. And what does referring that to other agencies look like? I've seen it work well in some cities where there's multi-agency task force that works with other organizations in a wraparound sense of wraparound services for the family. When we talk about poverty, when we talk about the lack of education in some neighborhoods, even food deserts, these are all things that make children more vulnerable. So how do we address that? Because it just can't be one social worker. It also has to be the healthcare professional. It has to be the law enforcement. And there has to be community-based stakeholders that collaborate to protect this child, not only from trafficking, but all the other elements that surround the vulnerability of children just around the world, and being able to provide services and access to a way out, access to a way beyond what their circumstances look like. And that often is relied upon those community-based interventions and efforts to address some of those issues. And then also the education and economic empowerment piece of it. How do I, as a parent, and I am a parent, and how I think about how do I make my child less vulnerable? What can I do? What does it look like when that vulnerable population doesn't have access to vocational training or job placement or even microfinance programs that are targeted at at-risk communities that allow them to, develop and create businesses and a stream of income for themselves. And those who are looking to further their education, having the financial support, to do so. And oftentimes when we talk about protecting children from being trafficked, we cannot forget that, buyers were also children and traffickers were also children. So when we are discussing protecting victims from becoming sex trafficking victims, that one approach covers all three facets of it, the buyer, the trafficker, and the victim. And in addition to that, just making certain that we have child protection policies and legislation in place. As the supply and demand, we've got to have something in place that hold buyers responsible. And holding buyers responsible to a point where it just makes people take a pause. And not only holding them responsible, but how are we holding them responsible? And how are we educating the younger youth to the dangers of not just being trafficked, but being a trafficker or even becoming a buyer? So these are some of the things that we often discuss, in PACT, and as a survivor council, we work to legislate or work to lobby and work with legislators to push forward some of these bills to protect children, and also provide an opportunity for people who have been trafficked to see a way out and what it looks like outside of the life and what we call life after the life. And that's all that I have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. We at PACT are just so deeply appreciative of the work that the Survivors Council does every day to inform our work, and your leadership in terms of working with the council to really implement their recommendations. I was particularly struck by your comment that when we're doing prevention education, we're not just preventing the creation of victims, but of buyers and consumers, right? Of the buyers and traffickers. So really powerful. So I see that there are some questions in the chat. We'd love to just request that people save questions to the end, and we're going to try to get to everyone. Our next presenters will be speaking about programs and research of Covenant House to reduce the vulnerability of homeless adolescents to trafficking. Poverty, struggling to meet one's basic needs, is the largest contributor to this threat. And we heard this both from the Special Rapporteur, and Katrina, you reinforced that. But the underpinnings of their precariousness is multifaceted. In his July 2023 report to the Human Rights Council, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery cites why children and young people may be particularly vulnerable to homelessness: a lack of education and being subjected to physical and mental abuse, neglect, and abandonment, and, as he mentioned, family disintegration may push children and young people into street situations. These are evident, for example, among lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex young people, many of whom end up on the streets because they are neglected or abandoned by their families and communities. In addition, adolescents who escape from or age out of care arrangements are at a heightened risk of homelessness. Since 1972, Covenant House has provided housing, food, health, and wellness services and counseling to more than 1.5 million young people experiencing homelessness and survivors of human trafficking in 34 cities against 6 countries. Really extraordinary work being done by Covenant House every day. And I want to thank you both for being here. I'm very pleased to introduce Amanda Noble, the Manager of Research and Evaluation at Covenant House Toronto. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. So Fiona and I are both from Covenant House Toronto. So just to give you some context that we are in Canada. And I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm going to be talking about a study that I'm doing, which is called A Dark Intersection. And this actually looks at the intersection between youth homelessness and sex trafficking. So there are 2 main objectives to the research that I'm doing. The first one is to look at the intersection between youth homelessness and sex trafficking, and that is both the ways in which youth who are experiencing homelessness are more vulnerable to being trafficked, and that is going to be the focus of today, particularly strengthening the institution of emergency shelters to prevent trafficking. But the project also looks at how precarious housing and homelessness can impact a survivor's ability to escape and transition from being trafficked. The second objective is to look at the awareness levels of sex trafficking amongst the youth homelessness sector in Canada, with the goal of identifying training needs and methods to do so. And I don't have a lot of time to get into the methods, but there are 3 really important pillars to that, and that is that it is participatory. So every stage of my research has been grounded in the voices of lived experience and survivor voice. It's mixed methods, so I'll be collecting qualitative and quantitative data. And it is rooted in an anti-colonial framework, so I have partnered with an Indigenous research agency as well. So I'm going to share some results based on 23 interviews with survivors, the preliminary results. And I think it's really important to say that youth experiencing homelessness are not only more vulnerable to being trafficked, it's also often talked about as sort of a quote unquote risk factor, but they're actively targeted by traffickers. And so what do I mean by that? Traffickers will come to emergency shelters with the sole purpose of luring and recruiting young people into trafficking. And they can do this by either posing as residents, sending other people in to pose as residents, or loitering in the immediate areas outside. And so why do they do this? Well, my argument is that there is a combination of individual level targeting factors amongst the young people who are experiencing homelessness, and that is combined with factors related to the emergency shelters themselves that create a space in which trafficking can be very successful. So I think the targeting factors amongst young people are well known. Social marginalization based on identity, we've talked about that. Young people who experience homelessness in Canada are more likely to be Indigenous, racialized, neurodivergent, 2S LGBT. They're lacking basic needs. They have a strong desire for safety, so feeling unsafe within the shelter system, as well as their previous home environments. Having traffickers offer them safety is very compelling for them. Limited social connectivity, so being disenfranchised from their family and sort of this need for belonging. and finally, the impacts of trauma. So deep emotional pain, substance use, lack of self-worth, etc. What's not talked about a lot is that there are factors within the emergency shelter system themselves, which can be adjusted in order to create safer spaces for young people. The biggest risk factor is really just bringing large numbers of young people with these targeting factors together under one roof. So when we asked survivors what made them feel unsafe in the shelter system, the biggest thing we heard was lots of people. And that's because it really increases the risk that people will come in with ill intentions. It decreases the risk that staff will be able to pay attention to everything that happens. And it also has subpopulations that can be mixed together. So for instance, survivors talked a lot about having younger youth and older youth together in one space. So in Ontario, Canada, our youth population is 16 to 24. We did have survivors talked about who were 16, who were recruited by 24-year-olds, for instance. They felt safer if they were in a female-only shelter, there's not a lot of those for young people. So other factors are having numerous people sharing rooms or bathrooms. And this is because these are private spaces that are not on the radar of staff. So different things can happen within those spaces. So for instance, one of the survivors I spoke to was recruited by a roommate. Staff and young people not having trafficking on their radar. So this is going to be a big recommendation that I'll go into, is that not knowing what to look for, not trained on the issue of sex trafficking, and young people not even knowing what trafficking is when they come into the emergency shelter spaces. Having institutional, not trauma-informed spaces and staff can make young people feel less safe and less willing to talk to staff. And there are policies and procedures sometimes that have unintended consequences. So for instance, what I heard the most from survivors was really just about discharges that were based on rules, which put them on the streets, or they had to return to traffickers, as well as shelters that made them leave during the day, probably because they were supposed to be doing quote unquote productive activities such as job searching. But what survivors talked about was that often led to young people congregating in public spaces, wandering around the streets, and then they were approached by traffickers as a result. So the good news is that there are lots of things that we can do to prevent trafficking from occurring on site. So the physical space, I know some of these aren't possible given, funding restrictions, but if possible, to have smaller shelters or smaller or separate pods for subpopulations. Having a welcoming, non-institutional environment where young people feel safe. Individual rooms when possible, or at least fewer people in rooms, fewer people in shared bathrooms. Train security guards and monitored cameras outside for folks who might loiter outside. The caveat is that the security guards are trained so that surveillance isn't increased on people who disproportionately experience surveillance already, such as Black youth. Increased shelters for female identified and non-binary young people. And the biggest thing really is increasing education and awareness. So staff and young people need to have trafficking on their radar. Staff to be trained on trafficking, including what to look for amongst interactions among young people, red flags that a young person might be being trafficked, as well as how to talk to young people about trafficking. And the young people, we need to be able to have open conversations with young people about trafficking, what it looks like, what grooming and luring looks like, what to do if they're feeling like something is happening with themselves or their peers. Providing pamphlets and information amongst at intake, having signages around the shelters which tell young people what trafficking looks like in a realistic way, as well as what they can do. And when possible, having peer staff, because this does increase the relatability and the likelihood that they'll listen to folks. Finally, the staff are really important in increasing safety. A trauma-informed and non-judgmental approach is really critical because ultimately a lot of the grooming and luring interactions mimic regular interactions that staff may not be aware of. So we have to rely on young people feeling safe to talk to us if they're worried about something that's happening in their own lives or peers. Responding to concerns and allegations kindly and knowledgeably. When possible, having a high ratio of staff to residents, but importantly, that they're interactive and engaging while working. And finally, around the philosophy, policies, and practices, a lot of this really comes down to spaces, staff, philosophy that are trauma-informed. Allowing residents to remain in the shelter during the day, and I would say particularly in the day and age where everything can be done online, this is particularly important. Minimizing discharges from shelter unless it's a safety issue. And one thing is really the need to sort of develop policies and procedures for how to respond to allegations about trafficking on site. Because there is some disagreement amongst folks who work in shelters around when to remove somebody who has been accused of being a trafficker. And so balancing the need for people's right to shelter and the right to safety amongst the rest of the residents. And so there is still clear need to discuss this and come up with a solution. And that's everything. Thank you.
Amanda, it's really impressive research. You know, kudos to you. It's you take a lot of things that people working in the field sort of generally know, but really name it so clearly. So first, I want to commend you for something that we rarely hear in research, which is the anti-colonial approach and working with an Indigenous research agency. I think that's really powerful. As we know, not only in Canada and the United States, but globally, Indigenous people are more likely to be at risk for trafficking. I also found your use of the word, not to say just a risk factor, but a targeting factor, really very powerful, and something certainly that I'll be keeping in mind when we're working with young people. And then finally, I mean, you made many excellent, like really clearly recommendations that are grounded in people's lived experiences. One, I think that jumped out at me was a recommendation of allowing a young person to stay in the shelter during the day. There are many shelters that practice discharging people during the day. And the young people, you know, trafficking doesn't only happen at night, it happens during the day as well. And so I do know of young people who really, they had a place to sleep at night, but during the day it was unsafe. I could really go on, but there's so much more that needs to be said today. And, you know, again, shout out to Covenant House, and happily we get to continue talking about Covenant House's wonderful work by introducing everyone to Fiona Douglas. I know you just mentioned her, Amanda. Fiona is the program manager of Anti-Trafficking Services. Welcome, Fiona, and thank you so much for all the work that you're doing with vulnerable youth. And we're looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So yes, my name is Fiona Douglas, and I'm the program manager of the Anti-Human Trafficking Services at Covenant House Toronto. I oversee all of the anti-human trafficking programs. So this includes our residential programs, our case management team, crisis beds, and our preventative programs. It's my role to enhance current programs and develop new ones based on identified needs, but also the research that's completed by Dr. Noble and her team. So to begin, I'll speak a little bit about the programs that we currently have, as well as our approaches, and then I'll talk a little bit about the preventative piece. It's important to note that all of our programs work from a trauma-informed, harm reductive approach to better meet young people where they are along their journey. With these approaches, we notice an increase in successes and healthy relationships built with our young people served. We know that one way to prevent human trafficking is through meeting the needs of our young people, which Amanda touched on briefly as well. And this includes housing, a sense of community, belonging, and food, all of which is taken into consideration when developing our programs. At Covenant House, we have 2 crisis beds within our shelter for human trafficking survivors. These are the only safe beds within Ontario. This is a safe space for young people who are exiting a human trafficking situation, who require respite or are simply just contemplating whether or not they're at a space where they are able to exit. Because it is in a shelter, it is a short-term program and turnover is quite high. As Amanda had mentioned briefly, traffickers target homeless youth and are sometimes within the shelter. So knowing that information, Covenant House has taken necessary precautions to ensure that we are preventing human trafficking within the shelter, but also that we are responding to those who are caught in the act of trying to recruit an individual within the shelter. Youth that access these crisis beds are required to work with our advocate teams, who are essentially case managers. This is to ensure that they receive proper care and support, plus that added extra support needed to advocate for late curfew or staying in the room if appropriate, or whatever it is that they feel that they need to have a successful stay within the shelter. The advocate also works to help to connect them to workers and can follow them once they do return back into community. So because this is a shelter program, if say a young person comes into shelter for 2 days and decides that, they have to go back to their trafficker or whatever their situation is, the advocate can actually continue that care and support while in the community. And that includes even if they head into different jurisdictions, they're still able to provide that ongoing support. With our residential programs, we have one house that's called Avda House, which houses up to 6 young people. This is a shorter term program where young people are able to stay for roughly 6 months, but with inflation and the high cost of rent, we're seeing young people stays are being extended beyond that 6-month period. In this particular program, we provide opportunities for survivors to focus on their healing and recovery while engaging in therapeutic life skills programs. Our houses are staffed 24/7 to support young people, especially in moments of crisis, as we recognize that the path of recovery is a non-linear experience and the needs for each looks quite different. Our second program is called Rogers Home. This is a transitional program that also houses 6 young people. They're able to stay there for up to 1 year without paying rent. The young people that access this program are much further along in their journey, and they have essentially a day plan in place, whether it's school, work, or just treatment focus. They have something that's keeping them busy. Rogers has a heavier life skill component that encourages young people to build life skills while preparing them for independent living. The house is also 24/7, and the hope is that when a young person leaves Rogers Home, they are transitioning into a house on their own. Sometimes we do see the transition to another transitional program if that's what they've identified as their need. We have the case management team, which we refer to as our advocates. This is a much smaller team that consists of 3 advocates and 1 youth and transition worker. This team provides ongoing support to young people all over Ontario. Support ranges from legal support to case management, crisis management, connecting survivors to external supports, including healthcare services and more. I always like to think of our advocates as the ones who do it all. They work from a trauma-informed approach to ensure that they are providing individualized support to help young people identify and reach their goals. So it's important to note that the caseworker is never telling the young person what they need to focus on. They're always listening to what is the young person hoping to achieve and to help support them along that. Now, most of our programs focus on survivors between the ages of 16 to 24 years old. Over the last few years, we have been able to expand our services to take preventative measures. We have 2 therapists who work on our anti-human trafficking team to support a younger age group starting at 13 years old. It does extend up to 24 years old as well. Our therapists work with the young person and their identified family to strengthen relationships and supports within their natural environments. We have seen many young people who are at great risk of being trafficked stay or return home as a result of this program. One of the benefits of this program is that therapists are actually able to visit the young people and their families at home, to have meals with them, and to teach them how to develop the skills that are needed to best support each other. When I say being at risk, I speak to young people who are highly vulnerable, either connected to traffickers, engaged in risky behaviors, or if we've noticed young people who have had an increased online activity that is concerning, or experiencing a combination of various challenges. Covenant House works to prevent human trafficking through our current programs, our public awareness campaigns, and providing ongoing training and education to child protection services, law enforcement, parents, service providers, and youth in the community. So we have many different approaches depending on who we're speaking with, as well as many different presentations and presenters who go out into the community to engage with various members of the community. We make it our priority to teach and educate others in the community around best practices and approaches to prevent and support our young people, because we know that it can happen to anybody.
Thank you, Fiona, for giving us like a really brief but really comprehensive glimpse of the kind of services that you're doing to really address this issue on all levels. I find it really heartening that Covenant House is being so intentional about trying to navigate this space between like recruitment for trafficking within your space and trying to make it a safe space for all young people. So great. It must be incredibly challenging. And I want to thank you and the rest of your team for navigating that. Not an easy balance. We're going to be looking now. I see that there are a number of questions already in the chat about immigration, which is quite topical. You must be anticipating that. We're really honored to have Dr. Christian Tuala joining us today from PACT. Migration has become one of the most important challenges of our times. Throughout history, people have always migrated to the benefit of many individuals and societies. But global challenges such as pandemics, climate change, conflict, marginalization, and poverty have forced many migrants to move without safe and legal processes, making them vulnerable to exploitation, including sexual exploitation. Having settled into a new country, families often struggle with finding decent employment to support themselves. The cultural mores and language differences can be challenging. These insecurities can make them targets for predators. Education has long been a key component of PACT's commitment to protect all young people from trafficking, and this includes immigrant communities. PACT has been working with children and adolescents in a variety of settings, from schools to community centers to juvenile detention centers. And most recently, PACT has expanded our outreach to recent migrant arrivals in New York, with a focus on youth and their families. Our aim is to provide these new arrivals with culturally relevant tools to keep themselves safe from trafficking and exploitation as they navigate their new lives in the United States. Dr. Tuala, we're looking forward to hearing you discuss more details about PACT's youth outreach programs.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cohen. And good morning or good evening to everyone out there and to my fellow panelists. The Educational Initiatives Department wishes to reach all children. This is a daunting task. And when I say all children, I do not only mean in the United States, but I mean in the world through partnerships. I think that is a theme that is a pillar within our programs, that we look to collaborate, partner, and move forward. To engage and support our youth, we must have an objective. And our objective is always preventive work, but keeping in mind that we will work towards the development of voice leadership of these young minds to reduce their vulnerabilities. As Ms. Cohen previously said, coming to a new country can be exciting, but it is also a need if we run from dangers, if we are looking to avoid hunger, or perhaps we don't have support from our country of origin. While it is easy to at times blame the country of origin, we are not proactive in looking towards how can we support this, right? While in a new country, the individual will look to connect with those in similar situations, those who speak a similar language, or perhaps just simply looking for help. As a migrant, we do not have the luxury of time. We must adapt, learn a new language, and survive. All this while at times dealing with hunger and homelessness, as previously mentioned by my fellow panelists. To reduce these vulnerabilities, we not only engage youth in English. To be quite honest, English is not the official language of the United States. As such, we view it that every language counts. And we look to engage with youth in the language they understand and feel comfortable with. If we look to create a positive community, then it's not only what we bring, but what they bring with them. We engage in conversations and workshops on how to make friends, how to have a positive friendship with a fellow, how to perhaps if a youth does achieve a job, then how to make sure that they are safe within that job, how to engage safely online, and how to avoid possible dangerous situations. These are only a few of the topics we cover. Our work really is based on time. We engage with partners for as long as they will host us or have time to host us. Or if it's an immediate concern, we will do a workshop one day at a time. We provide information on where youth can get help and who can help them. At times, we take that information for granted because we grew up with these support systems and we know where to get help. As a newcomer to a country, especially a youth, they might not be able to know where or who can help them. At times, public schooling is a labyrinth. Yes, there is help available, but where do we find it? What room is it located in? And perhaps what organizations are attached, nonprofit organizations are attached that can help us, right? It is important for them to know that they are part of a community and that they are not alone. If it takes us to start that conversation, then so be it. Starting from the belief that in order to change the status quo, we must create or help foster a positive community, we engage with youth and adults in conversation and learning and experiences. These workshops will involve fun activities, food, and community building. You might ask, food, community building? Yes, that is important because culturally, food and community building is time for family. And it is that foundation that we go with. Because when we bring that to the table, others will know that the intentions are well meant. Yes, we engage with adults because it is our belief that in order to keep a child safe, we must include all stakeholders. As Ms. Cohen previously mentioned, yes, there is a migrant crisis here in the United States. And as such, many adults are seeking help. Okay? When we speak of adult migrants who might not be allowed to work legally, they face a challenge. Just how do they take care of their children? How can they feed their children? This in turn creates a vulnerability that puts them and their children at risk of possibly being trafficked, possibly being exploited, taken advantage of. This is where PACT enters the conversation and engages, as previously stated. You might ask yourself, well, I'm speaking here today. Where is this education? I can assure you that this very moment here, Eastern Time, 11:30, all of our youth associates, education associates, are out in the field educating, engaging with each child that is possible to engage with and creating new partnerships. Right? We continue to engage and firmly believe that knowledge and support are needed to reduce vulnerabilities and that one size does not fit all. That is why we will continue to differentiate workshops, events, and places of engagement, not only entering schools or youth serving organizations, but also shelters if we're allowed to, and if not, places that are shelter adjacent. Bringing that knowledge and sharing, because one thing is for sure, the migrant population is here and they also bring knowledge with them and they have a way to contribute. And by sharing information and knowledge, we can at least help them. And knowing that their child and them have a way to maintain themselves safe. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Christian. I have to get used to you calling me Ms. Cohen, but very makes me really proud to see the kind of work that the education team is doing with vulnerable migrants. I do want to add that these services are available for free, and if you're in the United States and you are experiencing an increase of unhoused migrants in your communities or migrants in an unstable situation, please do reach out to our organization, info@wearepact.org, and we'll see if we can try to get some of our education team out there to work with members of your community. We are working on a national scale on this program. So all of us and this group have talked about the importance of working with youth, focusing on the needs of youth, creating a safe space for youth. And I am really pleased that we are able to have a youth representative, and I believe we'll be having 2 youth representatives, but I want to start with the youth representative who hopefully you'll be seeing on the screen here, who actually worked with PACT through our YACT program, which stands for Youth Against Child Trafficking Program, and who now serves as an advocate and a trainer for other young people. So really a model of what our program aspires to do. And I'll be introducing him as Alex today. Alex, I want to thank you so much for joining us. And I understand you might have some comments or questions.
Thank you, of course. Yeah. So I work with youth and adults. Oh, sorry. So thank you for introducing me. So I work both at the YAC and also at the CSM, which is still the same program, just oriented with adults. But I think my question for just all the panelists here present, we all know the importance of education and awareness that we spread within our community and stuff. And I feel like somewhere along the way, with educational workshops, there's always that part where are we being proactive or being reactive towards the needs of the community? And at times it can be just more an immediate resource or task that we provide for the community. And then what then? How do we ensure the community are utilizing these resources or collaboratively working with them? So my question is more, what recommendations or proactive actions are y'all taking within your agencies to ensure that the resources and information we're giving out to the community are being used to their benefit?
I can jump on that a little bit. I've worked with direct services in the past, and what we found the most beneficial is when having wraparound services and you're having multiple agencies that are providing services for a child. We often had, well, not often, we had weekly meetings where we discussed everyone that we were serving. And so that created a bit of checks and balances. And also with different people at the table, whether it is the counselor, whether it's the person that's working with the parent as well, because we had people working with the parent as well as the child, because we can do as much as we want to do for the child. But if the parent's not a part of the bigger picture and that child has to go back into that home every day, it creates a bit of a off balance and a challenge. So we all met collectively and we would go through progress notes of what are the needs, what are we working on, what are the next steps? And oftentimes the child will be a part of their own solution, because if what we're offering doesn't work, we always want to know, like, what are your greatest needs? What works for you? How can we be there for you? And then implementing strategies behind what their goals are. And again, meeting weekly, meeting on a larger level once a month from a task force perspective, because oftentimes you're meeting with community law enforcement, you may be meeting with community leaders as well, so that they know and understand that the care for them is a collaborative effort.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I really appreciate that. Is there anything else anybody wants to add? I feel like you're really addressing the youth's needs directly there.
No, I think it's a really important question, and I think it's a really big gap as well, because assuming that education and awareness will result in something is, maybe not always the best way. But I think for us, and Fiona, please talk about this with the training and awareness work that you do, but I think a lot of it is ensuring that folks know where they can go and who they can contact as well, to continue to work with us. Do you want to add to that, Fiona, or?
Yeah, for sure. So that's it, right? We do offer a lot of trainings and education workshops here to different service providers, including like law enforcement. And I think just service providers knowing who they can contact if they have questions, and understanding that not everybody is trained in how to support and work with survivors, right? And so for me, a lot of it is being available to engage with other service providers and help walk them through, and also recognizing that sometimes if a young person is disclosing that they're being trafficked, that may be the only time that they disclose that, and they don't want to speak to a random person like myself. So how do I support the service provider who that disclosure was made to, right? To kind of equip them with the right tools to walk them through. Recognizing I am only one person, and so I think we are working really hard to have our advocates trained as well to be able to provide that support. And again, just like constantly being available when possible to to support others and provide that education.
Thank you all for these responses. And Alex, thank you for joining us today. We have another youth representative who pre-recorded her remarks because she's still in school. And I'm hoping the manager can play that recording.
How should a young person experiencing vulnerabilities such as poverty approach advocating for their own safety and well-being when many times these vulnerabilities are upheld by broken systems and inequities beyond our control?
Wow. Okay. So not exactly a softball question. Who wants to take this one on?
Who wants to go first? That's a big question.
I mean, I think in some ways, that folks who are dealing with these sorts of issues and safety concerns shouldn't have to advocate for themselves, that it should be incumbent upon the people who do have sort of the power and the ability to do that. So that's what came to my mind immediately. But yeah, it's definitely not an easy question.
Katrina, anything you want to add?
Advocating for themselves. I mean, you know, one of the biggest it's difficult to answer because they should not have to, you know. And what's unfortunate is that so often children are put in that position, and even if they are housed and have parents at home, oftentimes they're not even comfortable going to their parents. So what does that look like? And again, I think it just falls back on the community. And as adults, you know, we have to be people that children can trust. And then in that space where it's like, okay, I don't have that, where do I go? Where do I turn? I've found that those who have the strongest voices tend to be avid readers and curious, and they're digging, and they find a lot of strength in the stories that they read, our education, and to not be afraid to keep knocking on every single door until you get the answer and the response that you need, and having that courage. But community, you know, it's our responsibility. These are our children. It's our responsibility to do a better job for them.
Thanks, Katrina. I want to thank both Anna and Alex for their comments. I think this illustrates that our young people have a lot to ask, a lot that they deserve, and a responsibility that we as adults really have for listening and following youth voices. I do want to mention PACT. You know, we do have our youth council, and both Alex and Anna are participants in the youth council, and youth can be active participants in being the change, right? So we really encourage youth participation and activity. You are building the movement, and you have so much to add. So I want to thank both of you. Before we open our panel to questions, I do want to thank all the presenters for their really excellent remarks on how our programs are strengthening efforts to protect children and adolescents from human trafficking. In 2015, when the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 as its global plan of action to improve the well-being of people, protect the planet, and promote prosperity, embedded in the vision was the imperative that we leave no one behind. Yet, for example, homelessness is not mentioned in any of the targets and indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs were conceived to be interlinked, indivisible, and balance the three pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. In order to end for all time trafficking of children, we must build stronger institutions to end poverty, eradicate homelessness, provide education for migrant students, and respect and protect the human rights of all. And with that, we will continue opening the chat to the questions. So let me see where we are. We have many questions. I want to thank the audience for really your outstanding questions. So I'm going to follow up. Katrina, this is a question that we received and you mentioned it, but I'm also going to make this available to other people. There was a question about building trust. And you mentioned we need to be trustworthy, right? So there's a very practical question, which maybe I'll have Covenant House respond to, which is how do you build trust with youth who have often learned, with good reason, to distrust adults?
I can jump in here. I think a big part of it is following through, right? Not making promises that you can't keep. And if, I say like right now in Toronto, shelter beds are at capacity. So if you don't know if that young person is going to have a bed, you don't promise that you will find them one. But I will do my best to work and try and get you access to a safe space. And then following through on everything you say, right? And a big part of it too is if you don't have the answers, just say you don't know, right? And you'll look into it. I think that's a big part of it. A lot of young people have been let down by the system in various ways and have been promised things that they never got. And I think it's important for us to be aware of that.
I would add too that it has to be gradual and on the young person's term rather than sort of trying to continually force anything on them, but continue to engage with them, even if it's just, hey, how's it going? And sort of show them that your door is always open, regardless of behaviors or whatever might happen, or if they make mistakes, that you're still there. And one thing that I've continually heard from young people is they can tell the difference between someone who cares and someone who's there for a paycheck. And I think you really have to show that you genuinely care, because that comes through.
Yeah, really spot on comments, Katrina. I see you nodding your head. So I appreciate that question. We have two back-to-back questions about PACT's work with the migrant community. So I'm going to give both of them to Christian. Though most undocumented immigrants are from Latin America, China and India constitute some of the major groups arriving in the US now. Does PACT have the capacity to work in those languages? And then also, doesn't PACT have a program to train families in shelters to train each other to protect migrants against trafficking?
Well, thank you so much. Great questions. Let me tackle the first one. The answer is yes. And if not, we will reach out to our partners to actually partner with them to obtain a translator or someone who can actually translate in a language that perhaps we do not have the availability in. Once again, I would like to reiterate that partnerships are everything in collaboration. So the answer is yes. So if you are interested, please contact us, and I would be more than glad to partner with you and deliver this information. The second one is, yes, absolutely. And one of the things that I would like to follow up on is when I said, migrants bring with them knowledge. At times, individuals we'll say, well, they're uneducated, have limited education. And this is wrong to assume, because many individuals who are coming, and I'll speak for the United States, right, or migrating across the world, they bring themselves not only cultural knowledge, they also bring themselves education, whether it be perhaps elementary, but they have some type of trade, or some of them are actually college graduates with degrees. And again, because of assumptions, this gets quickly discarded and we don't think about it. One thing PAC has done is actually taken this into account in creating a modified train-the-trainer program in which we train individuals on how to deliver the information, how to engage with the learner, and how to answer specific questions. And what has resulted in that migrants are now the trainers. So they go into the shelters and they deliver the information within their own communities. And this is beautiful, because then it's peer-to-peer learning, not only restricted to youth, but to adults. And the results when analyzing pre and post surveys are fantastic in terms of the knowledge that they've acquired, and the questions that come through within the discussions themselves. So yes, we do have that, and in short, that's sort of like what the program looks like, and it's based on that particular belief that they bring themselves knowledge that, again, through collaboration, we can reach much more. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. And I just want to add to the person who wrote the question, I think for me, one of the most surprising things about the migrant community that PACT has been serving is we see a significant number of French speakers, which we had not anticipated. We do have French speakers on staff, but it really is a global phenomenon that we're seeing right now. We have a question about foster care. Could someone speak to the area of foster care children who are subjected to human trafficking?
What specifically about them?
We didn't get an elaboration. What I'm guessing is, are you seeing anything in terms of data? Or are you seeing any kind of trends? I know data is always elusive. I think people in the field recognize that children in foster care are at a higher risk. And I'm sort of using some of your language, thinking about children in foster care being targeted. I don't know what you've seen in your research.
Yeah, so we definitely did have some survivors who came from foster care who had been targeted, also recruited when they left their foster homes or when they ran away from foster homes. So I mean, to me, they're very similar group to youth who come into our shelters. So they have a lot of the same experiences and trauma. They have similar sort of targeting factors, and so to me, they're and a lot of the young people who experience homelessness have come from foster homes as well. So to me, they're kind of similar groups. So everything I believe I would say about youth experiencing homelessness would be akin to folks who are in foster homes as well.
Great. Katrina, I know you've done a lot of training in this area. Do you have anything to add about children in foster care?
Yes, I've also worked in tons of group homes as well. I really don't have much to add to what Dr. Nobles stated, but that goes back to them having to advocate for themselves because they don't have the support systems that are there. What I've seen in systems that work great is just making certain that the staff and those that are around foster care youth are trauma informed, are aware of the red flags to look for. Just to remind everyone, oftentimes when someone's being trafficked or even groomed to be trafficked, they don't know they're being trafficked. They can't identify like, hey, I'm a victim of sex trafficking. That's not going to happen, but just having the adults around them with the tools and the vocabulary and the words to identify as such and creating that safe space, for them.
Thank you. A couple of questions that are along similar lines for Covenant House. I'll read them both. Covenant House's engaging of communities is very important. Is this documented anywhere? And then I believe that there was another question just asking for information about your, Amanda, your statistics and any statistics that you're able to share. I know you mentioned that you have a report forthcoming.
The report that I have is based on the qualitative data that I just shared right now. So I think like the statistics for trafficking in general is very, we all know that it's difficult. And we do have some internal statistics from our own programming, but those are generally internal. So I think I would need a bit more of a specific question of which kind of statistics we're looking for.
My guess is anybody wants any kind of statistics because there's
I know it's so tough with this issue because it's so clandestine and yeah.
Yeah, maybe I should say accurate statistics is the right.
Yeah.
All right, so this is sort of an interesting question. can you give specific examples of what trafficking looks like that may surprise people not familiar with the issue? Although I suspect that many people on this call are quite familiar, but what's surprising? And maybe if surprising for general ideas, and maybe something that surprised you.
Can you repeat that question one more time? I'm trying to find it here, just to get more of an
Can you give specific examples of what trafficking looks like that may surprise people not familiar with the issue?
Just within the United States, it looks very different from parts of the country, from one part of the country to the next. Something that was an opportunity of education for me is when I would speak about trafficking in the Midwest. There was a lot more familial incest type of trafficking that was happening. And I guess what surprised me is how different it looks from region to region. And to learn not to be surprised by it, trafficking is trafficking in all its different forms. But as I began to learn more, it looks very different. And so don't stay stuck in the stereotypical, kidnapping, snatching someone in the white van with the dark windows. It looks different from region to region, and to be open to all the possibilities of what trafficking could look like.
Yeah, thank you. It's so spot on. I mean, so many of us, and especially those of us who are parents, we're teaching our kids about stranger danger. And I think one of the things people in the field recognize is that exploiters are often some of the people who are closest to our kids, because it's about the children having trust and then the betrayal of that trust, which is why I think that earlier question today about trust was so important. Some of the people who our children trust and sometimes love deeply are the abusers. So really watch a child's behavior, watch their activities. If their activities or their behavior, their attitude is changing, even if you're not letting them out among strangers, there may be something happening sadly, much closer to home. And again, I think we're really, there's so many more fascinating questions. I want to thank everyone for putting them in, and I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to ask everyone. We could continue much longer, but I do want to thank our participants today for your insight and your expertise and your generosity of time. To our co-sponsors, PACT's UN committee co-chairs, who are board member Elizabeth Schumann and our former PACT chair, Jackie Shapiro, who also was extremely instrumental in drafting these remarks. I'd like to thank PACT's wonderful UN committee for this and the many other UN panels that they've been facilitating, as well as my PACT colleagues, Jamelia Ramos-Chapman and Cecile Kerwin. This concludes our presentation. And again, I want to thank you so much for your participation.